I'd like to first introduce, under the Responsible Resource Management theme, Sam Capon from the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith, looking at the capacity of riparian vegetation in the northern Darling Basin. Something I'm very interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll just go back a slide. So this is a first for me, both speaking at a cotton industry forum and in a cinema, but I'm glad I came up with a suitably grand title for the setting. So now that I've drawn you all in with that title, I'll have to let you know that I'm not really going to be able to discuss all of that today. Obviously it's a very big and complex topic, but it is what my research aims to tackle, and I've been working on these issues for coming up to 20 years now, starting in the Channel Country in the Lake Eyre Basin and gradually being pulled towards the east. So my work looks to understand how riparian vegetation can resist disturbances and change and stress, how resilient it is, so how it can bounce back following disturbances like the drought, and what capacity it has to adapt to that change. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you how important riparian vegetation is in the landscape, and especially in semi-arid agricultural regions where, as you can see, it's often the only intact vegetation left in the landscape. And so I would suggest that riparian vegetation in an ecological sense is possibly the most important part of the landscape in these kind of regions. So the kind of work that I do seeks to inform a range of land and water management practices. So I came from a background which was to inform water management planning, and that's moved into areas informing restoration planning, conservation planning, and increasingly practices that can happen at a farm scale, so informing things like my BMP. So my current research really focuses on the regeneration of riparian vegetation as a key component of vegetation resilience and adaptive capacity. So the kind of broad questions, research questions that drive my work are: how does riparian vegetation regeneration vary temporally and spatially? And at the moment, and for a long time, I've been particularly focused on the northern Murray-Darling Basin. What factors drive those patterns in regeneration? And then what are the implications of those patterns and the drivers of those patterns for land and water management at a whole range of scales? And so just looking at this image here, which is taken in the lower Ballon, you can see illustrated a few of the issues that this research is pertinent to. So firstly, dieback in the mature vegetation. So people are concerned in different parts of the basin and elsewhere about what visible dieback of mature trees. Secondly, there's concern from different parts of the community about a perceived lack of regeneration. So as you can see there's lots of areas where there's very few seedlings of woody vegetation. And thirdly is an issue of woody thickening, woody encroachment. So where there is regeneration, you're getting single age cohorts occurring, this increasing shrubbiness in the landscape, and a potential lack of diversity. So these are the kind of issues that my research is tackling. So I first started working in cotton growing areas about 4 years ago with the Cotton CRC in a collaborative project with the New South Wales and Queensland governments associated with water management, which was to look at riparian vegetation regeneration responses to the re-wetting after the end of the drought. So we did work over 2010, 2011 and 2012 to have a look at what that flood did for riparian veg regeneration. And at the time, and probably still is the case, the common wisdom, and especially in the water management planning world, is that big floods will lead to regeneration in the riparian zone. And certainly that's what was observed a lot in the southern parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, lots of river reg recruitment. So we went out across the northern basin to expecting to find a regeneration response to those floods. We did some detailed surveys, and we also did a sort of more rapid survey over a bigger area across the north. And what we found in our detailed surveys after the 2010 and 2011 floods was very, very limited recruitment. So as you can see across all the sites that we surveyed, There were very few coolabah or river red gum, which I guess are the species that people are often very concerned about recruiting in those riparian zones, but quite a lot of recruitment in these shrubbier species, so like the river cuba, which is Acacia stenophila, and the tangled lignum. And I should say the work that we're doing is focusing on riparian zones, not floodplains. We're looking at the top of the banks as the functionally important part in the landscape, not riparian areas further out into the floodplain. And in that broader survey across all of those northern basin catchments, there was a similar picture, very patchy recruitment after the 2012 floods, a little bit of a better picture for river red gum, but mainly recruitment, one or two seedlings at most sites across that whole area. But occasionally these patches of thickets of seedlings, and interestingly where these patches occurred were all grey sites at that time. So when we drilled down into our data to look at the factors that were driving the patterns of the seedling abundances that we did record, we were also surprised to find that flood history was not one of the most significant variables predicting the distribution and presence of seedlings, but rather canopy cover and recent local rainfall were the driving variables influencing seedling presence. So as you can see there in that diagram, our modelling found that lignum recruits were much more common where there was low canopy cover, and river cuba, casuarinas and other acacias were more common under higher canopy cover with cuba occupying areas with lower rainfall. So in fact the timing since flooding didn't come out, or duration of the last flood didn't come out as significant in that modelling at all. We also tagged seedlings and looked at their responses, growth responses and survival to flooding during that period. And as you can see across this selection of species here, the responses of seedlings, so we call seedlings here plants that are under a metre tall, so relatively young recruits in most instances, the responses were quite variable, both within species and between species. So you can see there with the river cuba, the small recruits were all lost in response to flooding, whereas the larger recruits benefited from it and really put on some growth. The coolabah, surprisingly, showed a pretty mixed response, but over 70% of the seedlings that we tagged showed a negative response and actually died or dropped growth in response to the flooding that occurred then. And the whitewood, which is the Adelaia hemiglorca, which grows slightly further up higher elevations, showed a mostly positive response to flooding, but a much slower growth in response to it. So based on that work, obviously, there was quite a lot going on, and it wasn't a simple matter of flooding promoting regeneration and realising that a lot of these local factors are possibly more significant in terms of driving these patterns. We've commenced a new project, which we're about halfway through now, to try to understand patterns in riparian vegetation regeneration. These are our sites to date across there. We've got lots of sites in each of these areas. And we've been looking at woody vegetation and also ground cover. We've looked at dispersal, seed bank. We've done glasshouse experiments, and we've got a lot of data, and we're only just starting to process it now. So you'll have to forgive me for having quite preliminary results to show you of where we're getting to with this work. But in general, our findings to date, moving into 2013, 2014, is that mostly the mature trees in these sites that we've been visiting are in good condition. So approximately 70% of trees that we recorded were in the top condition categories. We've also found seedlings present at all of the sites we've gone to, but again in low to moderate abundance. Interestingly, the seedling banks, which are present at riparian sites, often differ from the overstory vegetation in terms of their composition, which indicates a potential for a change in canopy cover over time. Again, river cuba was the most common recruit that we've recorded across this area, followed by coolabah and then some of these shrubbier species. But again, we found very few river red gum recruiting in these riparian zones. In terms of all of those species, and river red gum especially, seed production supply does not appear to be limiting. We've been recording that and looking at its viability, so there's plenty of seed for recruitment. So we've characterised the the mature vegetation as well as the seedlings now across all of these sites, and this is sort of preliminary data showing a kind of measure of shrubbiness, so to be indicative of woody thickening or shrubby encroachment in these riparian zones across the major rivers that we've looked at, and also across different zones within those rivers. And what you can see is those rivers in the lower Ballon there, this is also on a log scale, so they're a lot more shrubby than the other rivers. Yeah, so there's something about the lower Ballon, and it could be many factors, and that's what we're starting to look into, that leads to greater shrubbiness in those habitats there. We've also been conducting experiments to look at which different stages of the life history of the plants are shaping these patterns that we're seeing in the field. So we've looked at the role of seed supply, and in particular we're looking at the composition and viability of different sources of seed in the riparian zone. So we've looked at soil, which is commonly looked at, and we found 60 species at this time. I think we're now over 100 species for the soil seed bank, although a lot of them are exotics. To the delight of our PhD student helper, we also looked at scats. He collected those for us, and they've been surprisingly diverse in the seeds, viable seeds that they're producing. So there's obviously a role for macropods distributing seeds around the landscape. But I think what's interesting to us is litter emerging as such an important source of seeds, and especially it being the only source of woody seeds really in the landscape that we've looked at. We've also conducted some experiments to look at the role that germination is playing in shaping these patterns. So these are messy graphs of a student, but basically what you can see in these graphs, and this was done for Queensland bluebush and also coolabah, but in this case, in this experiment, all of the coolabah seeds that were collected were rotten. So there is some indication that that the seed supply in coolabah can vary spatially. In other times, it will germinate rapidly. So you can see different species germination are differently favoured by flooding or damp or dry conditions. So red gum doesn't appear to prefer flooding. It prefers the damper conditions, while lignum's favoured by the flooding. And all the species that we've looked at were promoted, germination was promoted by shade, but inhibited by litter. So while some species can germinate under a little bit of litter, shrubbier species like the Queensland bluebush that occur further out in the floodplain were completely inhibited by litter with nothing emerging. And then we've also gone on to look at the role that seedling establishment is playing. And in particular, because we're interested in this potential for shrubbery encroachment and thickening of species being able to move into the riparian zone from the more mesic floodplains or terrestrial areas, we've been concentrating on contrasts of riparian species with neighbouring species. So in this experiment, these results are looking at Acacia stenophila and Acacia pendula, or weeping mile, which pretty much clearly show that the weeping mile, so the more terrestrial species, its seedling growth is inhibited by flooding, whilst the river coupe is not, and they can survive for a long time. So this graph here actually shows the condition of seedlings after 6 months of continuous treatment. So the river coupe is very tolerant, but the weeping mile is not. And again, shade is an important driver of these seedling establishment patterns. So in summary, what our results are suggesting is that the regeneration patterns are constrained at all different levels of the life history, from seed production, dispersal, germination and seedling establishment, but it really varies a lot between species, but also, and I think this is important, between different locations and over time. So our results are finding that flooding promotes regeneration of some species, such as lignum, but it's not critical for others, like river red gum, where previously river red gum regeneration is thought to be driven entirely by flooding. We're not finding that at all. And we're finding in other species, such as coolabah, that flooding might actually impede seedling growth at an individual level. That doesn't mean that flooding is not important for regeneration at a population or a landscape level, because what it may actually do, rather than promoting growth in seedlings, is promote thinning of these thickets of seedlings, which may then be critical for vegetation diversity. And we're also finding that local factors such as canopy cover and litter load have a very strong effect on regeneration, and actually probably modifying vegetation responses to flooding. So without having a good understanding of those local factors, we can't understand flood requirements or responses to flooding either. So why this is important is I think our results altogether indicate that there's a strong potential for vegetation in riparian zones in the region, particularly in response to drier conditions, in response to further drought, but that the local conditions such as grazing and clearing really mediate the responses to drought. So the best practice in riparian zones is really to minimise disturbance, and particularly after floods. This is when the areas will be, riparian areas could be vulnerable to germination and regeneration of that shrubby vegetation. I think the results also have implications for riparian buffer width, so if conservation of existing patches or regeneration of patches, there's a suggestion there that the narrower strips are going to be more prone to that shrubby encroachment and thickening. And I think our results will also be able to feed into the environmental flow management in the region and water resources management planning, to try and shift the focus away from the requirements of individual species to populations and landscapes and the dynamics across the landscape, rather than currently, which is about what one species needs as a blanket requirement across the whole area. So where we'd like to go to next with this kind of work is to look at how the riparian vegetation structure actually affects its ecological function. So what are the implications of this increasing shrubbiness and woody thickening for the way riparian vegetation functions in the landscape in terms of its ability to shade the in-stream systems or provide refugia to terrestrial wildlife, or influencing nutrient cycling, water filtration, and all the other really important functions that riparian vegetation plays. We're also really interested in how a natural regeneration in agricultural areas can best be managed, so where and when and what kind of interventions, if there's manual thinning required. And we're also getting much more interested in understanding how riparian vegetation has changed historically through whatever sources we can access. But as part of that, I'm going to embark on an oral history project, and I'd like to encourage anyone here who has stories or knowledge of local change in vegetation, or even indeed no change. I'd love to hear from you and document the local knowledge about vegetation change from people who've seen it for longer than we're able to in our field trips. And I'd just like to acknowledge a lot of people that help out with these field studies and experiments. I have a lot of field helpers, we have a lot of support from state government departments, and of course we have a lot of support from people who kindly let us come and work on their properties and take the time